It's my great pleasure to welcome Professor Sarah Williams, who is director of the Civic Data Design Lab in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning, DUSP at MIT. So today, Sarah's going to be talking about her new book, Data Action, Using Data for the Public Good, which I think of as the much needed antidote to the so-called kind of data viz industry, which centers on a kind of give me the data and I'll make it look good philosophy. And one of the great things about Sarah's work is that she practices what she preaches. So although I've technically known her for more than a decade, because we briefly overlapped at the Sensible City Lab, the thing that really put her work on the radar for me was the $1 million blocks visualization that I know she's going to talk about. But that combination of kind of novel data, good old-fashioned legwork, and a sustained engagement with prison reform organizations created something that helped drive policy change. So that's a very high bar for the rest of us. But hopefully we can all welcome that kind of challenge. Without further ado, let me turn things over to Sarah, and thank you again for joining us.
Yes, thanks so much for having me. I just really want to thank you for inviting me to be part of your lab series. It's a great honor to share my book with you all, and I look forward to thoughts, feedback, because we are definitely intersect in the type of work we do. As John mentioned, I'm an associate professor of technology in urban planning at MIT, and I also run the Civic Data Design Lab, which communicates the insights of data to broad publics that affect policy change. And one of the ways that we do this is for visualization. It was just announced last week that I will also be the director of the Leventhal Center for Advanced Urbanism. And this center is interdisciplinary research center at MIT that brings together architects, urban planners, urban designers. And I think really one of the things that we hope to be doing is bringing in more technology and how technology is used in the design and planning of cities. So excited to be part of that. I just want to start by framing my background because I think it speaks a lot to the type of work that I do and the ways that I believe work should be done. I'm trained as a geographer, an architect, an urban planner, and a data scientist, and also in computer scientist. And the work that I do in the lab really sets out to combine those skills to create civic action. I believe multidisciplinary teams are essential for using data to action as they help contextualize the work within the policy area, communicate the results more broadly, and allow for new innovation. The teams bring their diverse training to the table. Here's an example of a team we worked on in Nairobi, and you can see we include computer scientists, architects, policy experts. We have people here from the World Bank, as well as transportation planners. And it's really through this work that we were able to have a real impact. And I'll speak about this project in Nairobi a little bit later. At the heart of all the work that I do is the belief that big data will not change the world unless unless these teams collect and synthesize it into a public benefit. So I'd like to give you an example of one project that explains this process. And I'm going to use an example of a project that now is close to 15 years old, but is still having impact and was even used last summer. This project that was a collaboration between Laura Kurgan, Eric Cadora, who's a policy expert, Data Reinford, who's a designer, and myself, a data scientist and designer, started with this data set from the criminal justice system that showed where people lived before they went to prison. Added up block by block, this data set showed where we spend over $1 million to incarcerate people in just 1 year. And here we're looking at Brooklyn, and those red dots or red blocks show that we spend over $1 million. When you zoom into this particular community in Brownsville, you can see over $17 million is spent to incarcerate people in just these 17 blocks. And while there is no money spent on the systematic reasons that people might be turning to criminal behavior, for example, could we reallocate that $1 million to better job training programs, to better educational programs, to some of the underlying reasons that many of these communities experienced increased rates of incarceration? In particular, the lack of programs to allow people to re-enter society once they leave prison. These maps were put on the wall, first seen on the walls of the Architecture League many years ago. And it wasn't just Brooklyn we looked at, but we looked at 10 different cities. And then we asked people from the Brownsville community, if they had just 1 million of that dollars, how might they invest it in the community in different ways? And here we have a workshop with community members, urban planners, policy experts, architects, and designers. And the maps were seen here at the Architecture League and then included in an exhibition in MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And you can see this in the back. And the reason I mentioned this is because these maps were seen by a congressman who then asked to use both our data and maps and research to advocate for the Criminal Justice Reinvestment Act of 2010, which allocated close to $25 million for reentry programming. Now, while that's just a drop in the bucket, you know, if we can see that $17 million is spent in just those 17 blocks, but it, of course, helped get some of the financing into helping use funds in a way that would systemic reasons for incarceration. I use this particular example here because this has come up a lot this summer in the conversations in the United States about defunding the police. In fact, I've seen the maps used often as a way to show if we were to reallocate funding, how we might do that and address that in a better way. So I think that this project really shows how we can bring data to action, how we can use a data set, quantify it, ground truth the results by asking communities, opening it up through data visualizations, through the maps that you saw on the walls, and using our expert teams to really contextualize and frame the project for broad publics. This is also the topic of my new book and why we're all here today. And I think the premise for my book really started with the reality that in the last decade, we have created an unprecedented amount of data, and which is set to increase by tenfold, largely developed by private companies, such as this data set from Google's autonomous vehicles. And while not all of this data is closed, like the previous example, all the excitement from civic hackers to consulting groups such as McKinsey and Google Sidewalk Labs, who set up a whole arm to apply data to cities, I felt needed some guidance. In fact, there was a pain in my side that many of the groups did not know the ways in which data intentionally or unintentionally can cause harm. And while criticism began to mount from academics about the potential misuse, here are some examples from Kathy O'Neill, Sophia Noble, or Virginia Eubites. And rightfully so, I found that we needed to explain to these data enthusiasts and my MIT students alike the ways in which we could use data ethically and responsibly and attempt to do that without causing harm. So data action really presents a corrective standard to data practices by acknowledging that data represents the ideologies of those who control its use. Data action at its heart was developed for data enthusiasts and novices, civic hackers, urban planners, and policy experts to provide guidance for using data ethically and responsibly. Data action asks advocates of big data analytics to rethink how they work with data to make the process more responsive to the people their work affects. And so what I'd like to do is pull out a few examples of what I'm talking about from each chapter. And while I would love to show all of the examples, we just have a brief time together today. The book is set up by providing an example from my own work, and then the rest of the chapter really looks at other people's work similar to myself. And so hopefully what you can do if you get data action is get a really great example of the different projects that I'm intending to highlight here. So let's start with chapter 1. Big data for cities is not new. In this first chapter, I position the reader within the larger narrative by providing an historical account of the ways those in power have used data to shape our cities, how they have reinforced structural racism, and how data has helped enforce the marginalization of various populations. At the same time, I illustrate the many benefits that analyzing data has provided society, such as establishing social services and stopping the spread of disease. The juxtaposition of these two outcomes provides a reminder that the person analyzing the data defines how it's used. In this era of Zoom, I was hoping that we could be a bit interactive. And I thought I would start by asking you all a question. So many of you might have heard of the recent interest in open data and its ability to spur innovation. But this is not the first time open data has helped create innovation in cities. Can you guess another time in history we had an open data movement? I mean, you could just put it in the chat. And I'm thinking of a case from London, in fact. So thinking about my audience here today, if you want a bit of a hint. I think you are absolutely correct. I'm seeing John Booth, Charles Booth, John Snow. I combined them too, sorry guys, mash up, and the water map. And I think that era in London was really the first open data movement. And I would say it started with William Farr, Britain's chief statistician, and really around the time, I would almost call him the first open data czar or the first chief technology officer of cities. He was in charge of the census, also in charge of opening that data up to groups outside of government. And really at this time in London, during the Industrial Revolution, really trying to understand how much the city has changed and using data to understand that. And many of you from London, I'm sure, are very familiar with both William Farr, Edwin Chadwick, and John Snow, who also highlight a movement in which statistics was really important to society, and kind of interest and renewed interest in using data to understand really the changing dynamics of cities. At that time, we see the report on the sanitation condition of the laboring population done by Edward Chadwick, which has really laid the groundwork for sewer systems. And as many of you mentioned, John Snow developing the Broad Street pump map, which helped highlight cases of cholera, and also Charles Booth's map of London, which is often cited as the first socio-demographic map made available. And one of the things that I do is help to set up this history, but also explain the ways that some of these tools might have caused undue harm in cities. So, many talk about how the Charles Booth maps were used for complete removal of neighborhoods and the replacement of social housing. Here, we're looking at the Nicholas neighborhood in London that was removed and then created Boundary Estates, which is London's first social housing. And the idea here is that showing that, a tool that can be both used for positive benefits, as Booth's maps helped address many of the social issues of London, but also was used as a tool that marginalized certain populations here, in particular Jewish population in London. Booth's maps really laid the groundwork for the technocratic planning movement in the United States, and the work of Hartland Bartholomew, who was the head of St. Louis's city planning department. And Hartland was hired around 1917 by the city of St. Louis in the same year when zoning based on race became illegal. And he was hired to identify a way to create segregation without naming it as a race issue. Hartland used extremely detailed maps of St. Louis, and is even quoted as saying the more desirable residential neighborhoods and to permit movement into finer residential districts by colored people. In fact, he used maps very similar to Booth to marginalize African-American population. And in fact, look at those thriving middle-class African-American neighborhoods and rezone them for incongruent uses, whether they're manufacturing, also bars, brothels were zoned in these communities. Bartholomew's tactics and strategies for using detailed socio-demographic maps was written about in his book called Urban Land Uses, and had a major effect on United States cities. In fact, Bartholomew did 563 zoning plans for US cities, and I would argue is one of the many reasons that our cities are very segregated. In his book, Urban Land Uses, he really discusses the need to use these kinds of socio-demographic maps to help marginalize communities. And these books were used at all major planning departments, including Harvard's City Planning and Studies. Another thing that we discuss in the book is the use of things like census data to reorganize political districts. And we discuss, this in previous eras, going back to even 1920, when we didn't have new congressional districts made, and to more recent events, which happened under the Trump administration, who set out to change the questions in the census to ask a citizen question, which he hoped would be used to undercount urban populations, as they would be scared to report themselves in the census if they were not citizens. So really, the historical section touches on a number of different issues, both from kinds of how technocratic planners post-World War II use of data, and looking at such benign data sets as the census and how they were used to oppress in the past. It is surprising, given all the hype swirling around the massive amounts of data in the world, that some essential data is still missing. This missing data usually represents the interests and needs of those on the margins of society, but it often represents topics that governments and companies seek to keep hidden. Chapter 2, Build It, challenges us, communities, and specialists alike, to create the data needed to encourage policy action. In this chapter, I use a project from Beijing to highlight how data is often hidden. And we can think about many ways that this is happening right now. But this project really started in China when I was looking at this picture and thought, how are they going to have an Olympics in this hazy, soupy mess of air pollution? And how can the Olympics be a way to expose air quality issues in China? In this project, we set out to both expose those air quality, to use devices and sensors that would allow us to make that measurement, and to coordinate with press to use the time of the Olympic to really target the largest audiences. So what do we mean by air quality? In this case, we were really thinking about the components of smog, and in fact, focused on two of those components, particulate matter, which are really the fine particles in the air that cause problems for athletes. It's often what's attributed to asthma. And we also chose particulate matter because there was specific policy that Beijing was putting out to address particulate matter concerns. Particulate matter can also travel very far. And so the Beijing government shut down factories in the region all the way to Hebei and Tianjin province. And we wanted to see how well those policy issues addressed the concerns of pollution during the Olympic. We also picked carbon monoxide, and over 3.3 million cars were removed from city streets on alternative days due to traffic regulations. And this was to address more localized pollution coming from vehicles. And so we chose to measure carbon monoxide for its localized effects and particulate matter for its more regional effects. At the time, the only information that many journalists had on particulate matter was coming from modal satellite data. And while it's helpful, it didn't get really on the ground feeling. And we did see the Wall Street Journal create a data visualization looking at that air quality, but we really wanted to know what was happening on the ground because air pollution is so highly localized. So we worked with the Associated Press to develop these air quality sensors. And here you can see one of the AP reporters at the Beijing Olympic site. And they set off to measure the air quality. And this is just one day before the Olympics in Tiananmen. And you can see that the hazy, soupy mess hasn't changed as much as we thought it would. So our reporters set out with their air quality sensors across the city. Here we can see that they went to the Olympic Park, Tiananmen, and the Temple of Heaven every day, as well as do a daily walk in and around the Olympics stadium. Here's one of our reporters with the air quality sensor. And I should note that while we had, at the start of this, close to 25 reporters collecting air quality, many of them were getting taken in by the Chinese government, not for the air quality sensors themselves, but for other pictures. So this poor individual reporter got stuck with doing most of the air quality censoring towards the end of the project. The data visualizations were created by the Associated Press, and anybody who subscribed to the program saw these visualizations, which showed that on almost all days, the air quality was well above the World Health Standards for developing countries, and even World Health Standard for developed countries, and well above what you would see in New York and London on the same day. And here you can see New York is yellow and London is blue. And you can see that in many days, we have close to 23 times the particulate matter measurements in and around the Olympic site. You can see in the final days of the Olympics, the air quality does get a lot better, and that's because it's raining during those days. As I mentioned, we really wanted this to be something that looked at measurements across the city, and what we did is then set out to measure the carbon monoxide along the Olympic routes. Here's our reporter again, starting by testing CO here along the marathon route. And we did a comparison in New York City on the same day. And these visualizations ended up in the New York Times. And what we did is we measured along the Olympic route before the traffic congestion policies were put in place. We measured again after, and you can see that in many places, by reducing the number of cars along the roadway, they were able to significantly reduce some of the traffic air pollution. And we looked at a comparison here in New York City. Data is not just seen through our sensors itself, but we use photographs to help highlight the change during the Olympics. And here you can see the first day. This is at the middle of the Olympics, in the middle and towards the end, and you can see that air quality improved. And while in this particular case, we were the only people reporting on air quality during the Olympics, the Beijing government did for some time keep the policy in place of having even and odd cars on the roadway at certain times of the day. So in this chapter, I don't just talk about how impactful having your own measurement strategies can be, but I also talk about how community data collection projects do much more than collecting data. They also really create communities around a shared topic and idea. And here's an example from a balloon mapping project that happened in the United States after the Horizon oil spill. And really this group of diverse individuals came together to map the extent of the oil spill and use it to advocate for their community. But I think what was much more strong than the data they collect is the team that they created to advocate for the needs of their community. And by coming together, mapping and collecting data, they created a stronger group advocating to the government for their needs. And we see this in not just the case of Louisiana, but other balloon mapping projects. And even this project, which was a crowdsourcing project to identify radiation in Japan after the earthquake. And one of the things that's discussed in this project is really how the co-development of the sensors gave the community involved a greater responsibility, both towards making sure the sensors work, but also for advocating for the changes that they needed. And that this co-building both of the tools to collect the data has a bigger impact than perhaps even some of the data that's gathered itself. Chapter 3. So while Build It describes how to collect missing data and use it to fill gaps in knowledge, Hack It shows that oftentimes data already exists openly, although we may not see it that way because it's stored, maintained by private companies. In some countries where data is tightly controlled by the government who produces it, privately owned data is the only data that exists openly for analyzing the dynamics of our lives. This third chapter argues that we ought to be creative in the ways that we obtain data to answer important questions about society, nonetheless acknowledging that data acquired for one purpose and applied towards another holds numerous ethical concerns that must be considered. Data action provides guidance for those who seek to use openly available data for their work. So in this chapter, I'm going to bring you to China, and we really discussed how we could use this open data or social media data to identify the phenomenon of ghost cities. And mapping residential developments, we hoped would identify risk in the real estate market in China, which could have global ramifications. Data about vacant development is not widely available in China, as is most data sets, in fact. And in this project, we really set out to identify ways in which we could find these ghost cities. And so we started with a model that is based on the premise that thriving communities need amenities, and that if you don't have amenities, you could be potentially a ghost city. We collected data from Dianping, which is the Chinese version of Yelp, about things like beauty supplies, shopping malls, grocery stores, etc. Then we got residential locations from AMAP and Baidu and overlaid a grid of 300 by 300 meters, which is the average size of gated communities in China. And then we measured the distance to amenities from the centroid of these residential locations. And then also took into account whether there were reviews for amenities themselves as a proxy for whether these are actually places people go to. We created an amenity score for each cell based on Henson's gravitational model, which takes into account the fact that we will travel much further in suburban areas to get to amenities. So the further away you are from the city center, you would allocate a different time to go to amenities. We looked at those highest amenity scores and then looked to see where those highest amenity scores clustered spatially. We did this for 10 cities. And as I mentioned, ground truthing is really important to the work that we do. Let me just click on next. Whoops. And so we went to Chengdu, Tianjin, and Xi'an to ground truth our data. In Xi'an, we found developments that look like this. This is a development that was built roughly 5 years ago, and the Chinese government would argue that eventually people will move to this site. And it's not about the fact that it's vacant, but preparing for people to come. So while these might lie vacant for 5 years, they felt it was important for their economic development to keep building, even though no one lives there. In another area, we found buildings that look like this, many stalled developments around semi-occupied buildings. And it should be noted that when the Chinese government takes land to develop these new housing projects, they give many of the apartments to people who lived there previously. So in this particular case, this apartment building is populated by some of those previous residents. I should also take a minute to note that sometimes these buildings, even though they were maybe mostly vacant, might be completely bought out because Chinese citizens often buy 4 to 5 homes as a way to invest their money. And this was a more common phenomena before the Chinese stock market, but is still a very common way that Chinese families store their money, and they might have these homes that lie completely vacant. We found other areas which were former communist housing projects, such as this, being readied for development. And then whole cities, such as this one, just outside of Xi'an, that were built and really never did anyone move there. Here we can see what was meant to be the science center. And then what we did is we took this data and we created data visualizations for the 10 cities that we worked in. And each visualization tries to uncover the algorithm behind our method by clicking on a cell and showing what amenities had created that high amenity score. So this particular red square, malls, and distance to a mall was helping to create the high amenity score, as well as schools. I think what's really important here is these data visualizations try to open this data up to broader groups of people. We use them in conversations with officials in China. Here, I'm talking to somebody from the senior urban planning department, where she talks about how vacant developments are controversial to local politics because many of the local planners know that the sites of these developments are not well positioned. And in fact, the deputy director of the Yuhang district in Xi'an says these decisions were based on theory and not open data. And he felt that they were much more based at the center of government, and should they have been done at localized planning departments, we wouldn't see as many vacancies. And by showing the data visualizations, I felt that we got more candid discussion of what was going on with ghost cities in China. This real estate developer really talked about how the burst of the real estate bubble will carry irreversible impacts on residents who buy houses with mortgages. So one of the things that was happening at the time is that the Chinese government was really giving out more risky mortgages in order to have more people buy homes. And it should be important to note here that really the bank and is really also has a really impact. It's the government as well. The bank and the government in China are one. And so when they are not getting repaid the loan because vacant developments are not being sold, they were often giving out new loans for new vacant developments to repay those old loans. And one of the things that this individual told us is really, he felt like it was a bit of a Ponzi scheme as the government and the banks were continuing to open up land and create a bit of economics in that way. The mismatch between supply and demand geospatially is a big problem, said academics, and addressing the oversupply is looming ahead. Ultimately, we created a map that identified risk in the real estate market in China. And I really think developed a foreclosure map, what would be akin to a foreclosure map if you were to have one in ahead of time. So really predicting those areas who might have the most economic fallout. And as with all my projects, we are really interested in bringing them to broader communities. So here we're looking at an exhibition in Seoul where this data visualization was connected to drone imagery that we used when we were ground truthing to help highlight and bring these issues to broader groups of people. Chapter 4, Hack It, asks us to innovatively find, acquire, and analyze data for policy change by communicating the results of those analytics ingenuitively. Chapter 4, Share It, stresses the importance of sharing the data both in its raw form and also through visualizations. Sharing data helps the public have access to information, acquire knowledge, and ultimately make better civic decisions. Sharing data through visualizations can communicate the insights of data without asking everyone to be a data scientist. Sharing data through visualizations is immensely effective because images allow us to quickly understand the topic, and at the same time, it is persuasive because we perceive that images hold the legitimacy of data. And so this is kind of the double-edged sword of data visualizations themselves. So in this chapter, we really talk about how opening data up, both through visualizations and sharing the data, is a really important way to create data action. And we use a project that I worked on from Nairobi, Kenya, as a way to illustrate this. I've been working in Nairobi for over 15 years. We created one of the first GIS data sets for a transportation model here. Were the first roadways we created and first land use density map. And really, I was focused on addressing issues of transportation and needed this data for my transportation model. But as we were working on our model, we didn't have information on matatus, and that's these vehicles that really act as the main public transport system in Nairobi. And we thought, not only did we not have this for our model, but local people in the community only could ask their matatu drivers how to get around. They also didn't have a map. So we thought, how could we create raw data for our model, but data that everyone could use and build upon? We decided to leverage cell phones, which are ubiquitous in Nairobi, to capture data about this informal transit system and open that data up for anyone to build upon. We developed an app with the University of Nairobi's computer science department, and we built the data for the system in a standard called GTFS. And GTFS is the standard for public transit data that's used in Google Maps. It's a open source standard. And the reason I mentioned that we did this here and stop and take note of that is by creating and collecting data in a standard, you instantly make it more usable. So not only is it used in Google Maps, but it's used in a wide number of open source software that are used in transportation planning, including looking at accessibility mapping. A GTFS standard is really a simple database, and it has lat and long information, stop names, and route locations. And as we used our app to collect data in the community, you can see that it began to create the roadways in Nairobi. But as I mentioned, we didn't want to just create something for our model. We wanted to create something that everyone could use and build upon. And so we decided to create a visualization that looks like a map that you might see in New York or London or Paris. And then we asked the Matatu drivers and owners to help edit the map. And what you were seeing there was them looking to the center of the north where there weren't a lot of Matatus, and the owners of the vehicles were really thinking about why those routes weren't there and starting to plan and develop in Nairobi. And it really became an instant planning tool and was widely popular and spread across social media and in newspapers who included that maps as an insert. And one of the things that I like to talk about in this project is how do we measure success in open data projects, and is when others leverage the data we created to generate their own policy change. So we were really excited when the government made it the official map of the city, and while they were largely disengaged in the process, they really got excited about using it here. Google made it the first map that uses informal transit system routing. So if you're in Nairobi, you can route yourself. And even the World Bank used our visualization to advocate for bus rapid transit systems. So this is not our map. This is actually a map of the bus transit routes, but they used the popularity of their map to propose their system. We had a hackathon where we showed civic tech community how to use the GTFS data, and there's over 10 applications now using it in the background. Semi-formal transit provides mobility around the world, and our work inspired places from Amman to Managua, and now we have a center that maps this transit data across the world, and it has a location in Africa and Latin America, and we have hope to have more cities that get involved. Just recently, we finished mapping Santiago in the Dominican Republic using the same methods of working both with the drivers, volunteers in the community, university to help map the data, and ultimately visualization experts to create the map. And here we're looking at the head of the union for the conchos, which is what those informal transit systems are called in Nairobi. The last chapter of the book really talks about how data should be used as a public good. And one of the things I focus on here is that Africa is a continent with a lot of missing data. And in fact, the World Bank talks about it as being crucial for formulating policy and perhaps creating a disadvantage for many of those people living in areas where data isn't collected. So much so that data is a really important part of the Sustainable Development Goals. But data exists, and this aggregated data, Facebook and Google and cell phone companies have data available, and really we wanted to talk about how we could use some of this data towards helping society. We worked on a project with Facebook that use this data set to identify areas with low amounts of internet use, really using those maps helped us target areas in which we could improve internet service. And we are currently working on a project called the Living Data Hubs, which adds internet service in Kibera, one of Nairobi's largest informal developments, by co-building a wireless mesh network and data collection tool with partners in the city. And I don't have enough time to explain this project, as I'm realizing I'm getting quite close to the time, but I'm happy to answer questions about that later if I have time to say, or if you have time to say. And I just want to end by saying that the book really talks about the principles of data action, which is to do no harm. We must interrogate the reasons we want to use data and determine the potential for our work to do more harm than good. That we should build teams. Building teams creates narratives around data for action and is essential for communicating the results effectively. That we should change power dynamics by building data and to allow communities to advocate for those own change. We should expose hidden systems like we saw here in the Go Cities project, but also in the $1 Million Prox project I showed you. We should ground truth our data. Validating the work is super important. And I think a great example of that was the ground truthing work that we did in the Go Cities project. And we should share it. Sharing data is essential for communicating the needs for policy change and generating debates essential for the work we would do with data. And finally, we should all create our own ethical standards for the use of data. Governments are far behind what is happening in technology, and it's up to us to create those standards. And remember that all data are people. Thank you very much. And I will open up for questions. I'm sorry I had to speed up in the end, but I realized I am short on time.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I really appreciate that. So as invited, please, if you could type your questions into the chat, and then Sarah will do her best in whatever time she has to answer them. I assume it might take a minute for people to get their typing fingers going. Well, I guess just while we're waiting, I'll exert chair's privilege and just sort of say, one of the things I'm always struck by when you get these different groups working together is, of course, the challenge of creating a shared vocabulary so that people understand what they're talking, the transport planner and the urban planner and the computer scientist. How do you negotiate that, manage that, generate that within kind of the interdisciplinary teams that you work with?
Great question. I mean, I think what's interesting is that part of creating that shared language is part of the projects that we work on, I think. And so it does often take a little bit longer to get a project off the ground as we begin to learn how each one of us communicates. But I think that's part of what makes the work impactful, because it allows us, like as data scientists, to really understand the policy and the policy questions, but them to also be able to ask us the types of analysis that they might want to look at and see. So I think that, all projects start with kind of a getting to know you phase.
So there's a question about, do you have any ongoing projects in Brazil?
I don't have any projects in Brazil right now. We do partner with a number of cities that have mapped their informal transit system. And so we have partners in Brazil who are doing that work. And I should just say that our Center for Mapping Data on Informal Transit really is structured in a way that those groups can do the work on their own, and we provide guidance. but it's meant to really be something that the network can teach each other to do. And we've really had great success in that. Like, for example, in the Dominican Republic project, it was really the Mexico City group that was teaching and helping with that project. So we really hope that there'll be cross-learning.
I can also see, I don't know if you have your chat window open, but I can see there's also a question here about kind of noise and bias due to, I mean, presumably the composition of the people participating in data collection.
Right. So one of the things I talk about in the book is really addressing bias straight on. And really, I would say express, because I think often, you know, what the purpose in which data is collected can tell us a lot about who's not included, who's missing from the data. So I think it's really always we investigate the bias at the onset. I think social media is really difficult to use because of some of the biases associated with it. I think in the case of the Ghost Cities project, we're less, let's say, using social media data, but using more of their Yelp. And I should note that we tried to scrape data from their version of Google and other points of interest data. And we found that actually Dianping was the most accurate data set. However, as you can see from the results of that project, we do have a bias, as it doesn't get the small community vendors. And so some of the older neighborhoods, like the one that I showed you, which was getting redeveloped, had many more of those smaller vendors included in them that wasn't coming up in the Yelp. So we should always actually highlight those biases in our reports and our research. I think in this case, it helped us show older communities that were vacant, which isn't necessarily the Ghost Cities phenomena, but also certainly important to planners in those regions as well.
And it looks like there's two questions there about how you choose and prioritize projects, Danny and David Hong, kind of related questions. One's kind of more you and one's more the lab, I think.
Yeah. Projects prioritization come from like all kinds of dynamics. I think at the heart of it, though, I think, you know, the lab is really interested in addressing those on the margins of society. So, you know, if people are coming to the lab and we see that that project can really help highlight some of those issues, we take it on, and sometimes we seek our own projects. So I would say, you know, in case of the Digital Mandatus project, we were really something that I always wanted to do. I've been working in transportation for some time and really didn't have this data set that, you know, represented 80% of the cars on the roadway. And that was something that was really driven by us. I would say the Ghost Cities project was driven by an interest at MIT to look at socially responsible real estate in China and to try to understand what that was. And, you know, they put out a challenge for us to address that issue. And we took it on both because we felt that it had a particular issue for many people who were over leveraging themselves in Chinese society. Hope that helps. So all kinds of different ways.